Okay, we're ready to start our next session, session 3 on psycholinguistics. And our first speaker is Laurel Schenkoske, and she's going to talk to us about Toward the Pronominal Grammar, a brief look at statistical alternations.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Laurel Schenkoske from UW Milwaukee. Thank you, first of all, for having me here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about something that I've only first become interested in somewhat recently. It was actually Nick Ellis and Diane Larson-Freeman who really got me interested in this whole idea of statistical alternations and like probabilistic constraints in linguistics about a year ago. So, and this is the idea, of course, that when you're exposed to input, you are kind of updating these probabilistic constraints of your language. And the structure that I'll be talking about is these prenominal clauses, PreNominal Modifiers. So first, a quick background on the PreNominal Modifiers in German, because they have it, and because it's a language that I'm familiar with. So first of all, German, just like English, has these participles. So German can have die kochende Frau, the cooking woman, die gekochte Frau, the cooked woman. But something that German can do is actually, extend their modifiers. So they can put something along with the participle, but crucially in front of the noun. So they can say die mit dem Jungen kochende Frau, the with the boy cooking woman, or die von den Kindern gekochte Frau, the by the children cooked woman. So in English, of course, we would use post-nominal relative clauses here, but German has this kind of optional relativization strategy where they front the modifier. And I know that, well, apparently Chinese does this too, although when I ask my friends, they kind of give me different answers on that. But there is a whole issue of SSLA put out a couple decade and a half ago about this phenomenon in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. And apparently it happens in Hungarian as well and in Russian. So it's a very well-attested structure. There's very little about it, though, in the English language. So about 40-some years ago, Kreen wrote an article about this on German and English. And he says that it's the same structure that German has that English has. And he says it's just a matter of efficiency and it saves on verbiage. And he goes ahead and gives some of these examples where we have this structure in English. So early evening thunder showers, 3 years in the drafting legislation, cradle to early grave phenomenon, get 'em out of bed philosophy, yet to be named committee, and the 5 times married actress. So it's actually these down here that I'm mostly interested in, and maybe some passive infinitives eventually too. 2 years later, Dean comes out to the same journal, and he says, no, this is specifically a German phenomenon, not an English phenomenon, and he has nothing to say about like Japanese and Korean. He's just talking about it's German, not English. And he says that one of the main differences is when Germans use this, it's more formal. When it's used in English, it's less formal. You're kind of consciously breaking the rules. More importantly to him, he says that it's a result of different transformational rules. So again, this is 1971, transformational rules. Not much has been said about it since then that I've been able to find. Also in German, it's getting less formal actually. It's used more in writing than in speech, but it's not at all. It's used at all registers of writing, and it's actually, there's evidence that it's becoming more and more used in spoken German. So like I was saying, it's been shown, a lot of people are doing some really interesting research on statistically changing a person's linguistic system. So my hypothesis was that native language English speakers would improve their reading times on PreNominal modifiers after just 2 exposure sessions. So they would actually improve or update their distributional patterns. And I do want to stress that I'm not talking about short-term priming here because my test went over a matter of days. So this is actually, I'm looking at statistical restructuring. So if we kind of step back and look at this on a lexical sound pattern kind of paradigm, we can see words like hint and mint. They're very frequent in the English language. They also follow this regular sound pattern. Hint, mint, right? Over here, pint is also just as frequent, but it follows a different pattern. It's not pint, it's pint. Dint, on the other hand, is very infrequent in English. I had to look it up. But it follows the regular paradigm. So when we're processing something like the word dint, we have these neighbors, these regular neighbors, hint and dint, that kind of help with our processing of this word. So actually, English speakers are able to process the word dint faster than they can pint. All right, so what Wells and friends did, and by the way, McDonald and Christensen were part of the et al. Here, they took two different types of syntactic structures, two different types of relative clauses, and kind of tried to lay them out in a similar chart. So they used the subject relative clauses up here, which are, of course, much more frequent than object relative clauses, but they also follow this regular kind of pattern. They're SVO. So every time we in English are exposed to anything in the SVO structure, that helps with our processing of subject relative clauses. Object RCs, on the other hand, follow an OVS word pattern. We really don't have that in English in a lot of structures. So the only thing that's going to help with our processing of object RCs is the actual object RCs themselves. Does that make sense? Okay. So they added a third layer to this. They added experience. And so they exposed their subjects to equal amounts of subject relative clauses and object relative clauses. And both, of course, improved because they had this task effect, right? And they were looking at reading times as well. But the object relative clauses improved more than the subject relative clauses. So it's important here to understand that it's the infrequent pattern that improved more. So this shows us that it's not just task effect, but it is an actual, like the subjects were supposedly actually updating their probabilistic constraints. So here's what I did. So I kept the subject relative clauses up here, and then just kind of for comparison, I added simple participles. And this is things like the cooking woman, yeah. So that has like this VS pattern. And then this is my structure, what I'm looking at, the PreNominal Modifiers, PreNominal relative clauses, if you will. So they also follow this OVS word pattern, which is very infrequent. Then I, too, went ahead and added the third dimension of experience, and I exposed my subjects to both. And the PreNominal modifiers improved more than the subject relative clauses. So this is just like a sort of a modified replication of the Wells et al. Study. The problem that I'm facing so far is that this improvement is not statistically significant. But they improved more, and I think that there's some more in my methodologies that I can update. So this is a pilot study, and I'm actually looking forward to some of your input at the end if you have anything to help me along. So just really quickly, this is like a participle relative clause pairing that you can look at here. And the only reason I show it is because I just want to explain quickly that I only used accusative verbs. Okay, so I only used verbs that can take a direct object. So, for example, the soup cooking woman, or the woman who is cooking soup. So where did I get my words? I took all of my verbs, the accusative verbs again, from a list of 100 most frequently used words in American English. And then I had to find some objects to go along with them. So I found this online collocation dictionary, and apparently the most frequently used noun to follow the verb find is body. So I used things like the investigator who finds bodies and the body finding investigator. But I was sure to avoid really frequent things like award-winning or cost-cutting. And I'll probably have to in the future go into it and look more at like frequency distributions, but so far I just sort of upheld it. So here's the setup of my test. I met with everybody 3 times, and in our first block we did a pretest. So these were self-paced reading times. These were their test sentences. 4 PreNominal modifiers. The body finding investigator hates his job. These are all 13 syllables. And then, for example, the citizens who write letters worry about this were my relative clauses. They went through this on a very kind of low technology scale screen capture. I used the screen capture Jing. So they saw something like this, for example. First they got their instructions. Okay, and then I just went back later on and measured the time through the screen capture from the beginning of each sentence to the end of each sentence. And then in the same session, we had their first experience block. So here they saw sentences, a whole sentence at a time, and then they were given a content question. Did you get it? So they would see a sentence like this, and after they had read it at their own rate, they clicked to the next one, and they had to give me their answer. So some of them said the customers, some of them said the interest-showing customers, and I recorded all their answers. I'm not really interested in them now, although what they said was kind of interesting. But the only reason that I had them do this was so that they're paying attention to the task. Then, usually 2 days later, we met again for their second experience block, and this was set up very similar. They had a different set of questions, or a different set of sentences, but they were exposed to it orally this time. So they listened to it, they listened to the sentences, and they saw and they wrote down their answers. Okay, 2 days later, we met again, final time for their post-test, and this was set up just like the pre-test, only now they had opposite type sentences. So rather than the citizens who write letters, they have the letter-writing citizens. And rather than the investigator finding body, they have the investigator who finds bodies, or the body finding the investigator. So they just saw the opposites. And again, they had this Jing screen capture. And again, I went and measured the beginning of the sentence to the end of the sentence. So these are their pre-test target sentences. And you can see that some people are much faster at reading than other people. Again, could be interesting for something, but it's not anything that has anything to do with this test. And you can see here that their post-test times all improved. Now, you can't measure like sentence 1 against sentence 2 because they're different sentences. But what you can do is look at within subject averages. So every one of these subjects improved their times, decreased their times from pre to post test, some more drastically than others. Okay, so my preliminary results show that each within subject reading time dropped from pre to post test. Aggregated reading times also decreased. And this is kind of expected, right, because of a task effect perhaps. But what's really important is that the infrequent structure, the PreNominal modifiers, actually decreased more. The reading times decreased more than the relative clauses. So just like the Wells et al. Study, this shows that the subjects probably updated their constraints. There was some sort of a change in their distributions. Again, my findings are not statistically significant, and there's some things that I think that I need to do in the future. This is, again, from Wells and Friends. And what they did is they looked at different regions of the sentence. So they were interested in this third region, and they only measured the time to hear. So I think that I need to, rather than measure beginning of the sentence to end of the sentence, look at something more like this. And if anybody has any suggestions for me, these are my 2 ideas of how I should break things up. And I would be looking at, my chart's got a little bit goofed up here, but I would be looking at one of these 2 regions, I think. So I'm also interested in knowing, can this be extended to something that's not direct objects? Rather than the soup cooking woman, could we say like the in the kitchen cooking woman? You can do it in German, you can do it in Korean. Could we extend it to something longer? Could we say with her children in the kitchen cooking woman? Can it be extended to something that's not accusative? Can we say the yesterday fallen building, the always screaming victim? All right, these are things that you can have in other languages. They're well attested. could we, if we expose English speakers to this enough, could it be something that they start to use in English? I don't know if that's really important or not. It's kind of interesting. But what I think is the real implications of this would be how we can use this in L2 teaching. And then once I get the study better figured out, what I'd be really interested in looking at is, can we use this to help teach our German, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Russian students the structure, or other structures as well? Because in German, I know it's used quite a bit, but it's never taught. Even in grad school, it's hardly ever taught in grammar classes. They're just sort of exposed to it here and there, but they have no idea what it is. So I think that this would be a neat way to start teaching our students. That's all I have.
We have about 12 minutes for questions, and please use the mic.
All right, this is a really interesting first step towards some of these questions. I've been interested in sort of people learning new structures for a little while. A suggestion on methodology, something you could take a look at. Alex Fine has a paper out, 2013. Fine, Farmer, Jaeger, some other people, he's looking at relative clause interpretation and learning across the experiment. So looking at one of these self-based rating kind of paradigms. I think the method's really nice. So if you're looking for new methods, new types of analyses, would be a good place to start.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick one since I have the mic here. So if you're suggesting then that this learning is happening over time and that just simply by exposure, but I noticed that when you were talking about applying this to second language teaching, you were talking about, well, students are exposed, but they're not really explicitly taught this. But I'm wondering, do your results suggest that we should just simply expose students to things, and that's a good way, and they will learn the structure quite quickly? Or are you saying that a different method would be necessary in order for students, in a broader sense, just teaching students any unfamiliar structure?
Yeah, that's really important, and I think that there's a lot to be said for implicit learning, and I think that in a way people don't even give it enough attention in L2 learning. But I also think that it's not enough. I think that we need to kind of combine implicit and explicit teaching strategies together. So yeah, they definitely need to be exposed, but then we need some sort of a focus on form. And I don't have here any specific teaching methodologies to suggest, but I think we need both.
I think the English things that you looked at actually are so-called deverbal compounds, fact-finding. And so you're not going to get like kitchen cooking woman, because there's a constraint in deverbal compounds that says only the so-called internal argument could be that. So what you're looking at German is actually, because German is a head final language, and you seem to have a lot more things that's preceding the participle. So in English, if you wanted to go to equivalence of that, then you have to use the phrasal compounds. That's a different story, right? And phrasal compounds can do very many things that relative clauses do. So I don't think, you can actually force, subjects to try to make sense out of strictly ungrammatical deverbal compounds, but it's not going to tell you anything interesting, because the languages are too different.
Following up on these last two comments, I think it would be worthwhile for you to methodologically to supplement this task with just a straightforward offline grammaticality acceptability judgment task, because it's possible that even though, as James was saying, some sentences are basically ungrammatical in English, but if you show them to subjects long enough, they might still get faster at reading them. But that doesn't mean that they actually have them as part of their grammar. So this might be important questions to tease apart, whether the exposure is just, you see anything frequently enough, even horrible sentences, you get faster at reading them, versus only the sentences that are actually grammatical can get improved through experience.
Right.
So
yep,
that's
that's
something
a good
to
idea.
consider.
So my question has to do with an orthography issue, in that when these sorts of constructions are used in informal writing, they tend to you hyphenate all the words together, and so you get, which you did in your early examples. So one thing you might consider looking at is if you were to get like a bunch of internet language or textual data, and just look for things that have like 4 different hyphens in them or something, in order to see what sorts of things along these lines people actually do use sometimes.
Right. You mean to go out there and kind of look at what's already been used?
Right. To look at it's a weird sort of structure, and you get this weird kind of orthography with it. And so one thing you could look at is how do people actually use it?
Yeah, and I actually do have a collection of just like things that I've been hearing and seeing and writing them down. And you get weird things that you wouldn't expect, like this plucked out of thin air idea. I mean, so you have the participle plus a bunch of other stuff.
This is pursuing the line of argument of James and one possible application of this would be, of this methodology, would be to check on the problem which people have often encountered, where people talk about MIT German, MIT Hindi, MIT whatever, where people get all kinds of structures which they declare to be perfectly grammatical. And the question is, are they, or are they simply riffed off of things which are kind of quasi-idiomatic, but then expanding them into territory where they normally would not be used and portraying them as grammatical? So in essence, testing on the age-old problem of how reliable are intuitive judgments about grammaticality.
Yeah, that's interesting too.
Any other questions?
Just very quickly, I want to mention that for measuring the experimental sentences, it would be maybe better to have some comprehension questions following the experimental sentences, just to make sure that they are really paying attention while processing the sentence.
Any other questions? We're about 5 minutes ahead of time, but I think we can just go ahead to the next talk. Everybody's here. Yeah, so we'll take a couple minutes break while we get the next talk set up.